The thing about the moment your life changes is that it never looks the way you expect. It doesn't arrive with a warning. It doesn't give you time to straighten your collar or rehearse what you're going to say. It comes the way cold comes in November, not all at once, but settling into everything until you can't remember what warmth felt like. For Doyle Mackinnon, it came on a Tuesday afternoon in the third week of October, in a conference room on the 14th floor of Harwick Industrial's head office in Calgary, while a man he had worked for across 11 years told him, without looking up from his desk, that his services were no longer required. Doyle was 43 years old. He had spent the better part of 2 decades working on heavy equipment diagnostics, the kind of work that keeps pipelines running and construction sites moving, the kind of work that most people in glass offices don't think about until something stops. He was not a man who spoke often or loudly, but the men who worked beside him trusted him the way you trust a compass. You didn't need to understand how it worked, you just knew it didn't lie. He had a daughter named Lily Anne. She was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and a gap between her 2 front teeth that she was very proud of. Her name had been Claire's choice, a combination of Claire's grandmother's name, and a name Doyle had loved from an old novel he'd read in his 20s and half forgotten by the time they were filling out the birth certificate. He remembered thinking, when the nurse handed her to him for the first time, that he had never been responsible for something so small and so entirely dependent on him getting things right. Claire had died 14 months earlier, pancreatic cancer, fast and thorough. She was gone in 5 months from diagnosis. Lily Anne had just turned 6. She had cried at the funeral with the complete sincerity of a child who does not yet have the vocabulary to contain grief, and Doyle had held her in the gray November rain outside St. Anthony's in Cochrane and told her it was okay to cry. That crying didn't mean you were weak, and he had said this while feeling the ground beneath him tilt in a way it had not tilted since he was 12 years old and his father had left without leaving an address. He had gone back to work 3 weeks after the funeral because there was Lily Anne to think about, and the mortgage, and because he didn't know what else to do with himself. In the evenings when she was asleep and the house was quiet. In a way, houses are not supposed to be quiet. And now this, the man behind the desk, was not Walter Vance, the president of Harwick Industrial, who had hired Doyle personally 11 years ago and occasionally still remembered to ask about his daughter by name. It was Terence Ogilvy, the new VP of Operations, who had arrived from a firm in Edmonton 8 months ago and had spent most of those 8 months rearranging things. He was in his early 50s, thin in the way men are thin when they're careful about it, and he had a habit of speaking with the measured calm of someone who had attended a course on delivering difficult news and believed it had made him good at it. "It's not a performance issue," Terence Ogilvy said. He set down his pen. "Your technical record is strong. We know that." "Then what is it?" Doyle said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, the way things come out flat when you already know the answer won't be the real one. "Restructuring. We're consolidating the diagnostics division. Third-party contracting is more cost-effective at this stage of our operations. It's not personal, Doyle." Doyle looked at him for a moment. Outside the window, the Calgary sky was doing what it does in October, cycling through 4 different weathers simultaneously. There was snow in it, and sun, and the kind of pale flat light that makes everything look like a draft of itself. "My wife died 14 months ago," Doyle said. Not because he thought it would change anything, but because he wanted it on record. He wanted it said in the room. "I have a 7-year-old daughter." Terence Ogilvy looked at him with an expression that had been carefully constructed to communicate understanding without conceding anything. "I'm very sorry for your loss. HR will walk you through the severance package. 3 weeks per year of service, so you're looking at." "I know what I'm looking at," Doyle said. He stood up. He shook the man's hand because he had been raised to, and because refusing would not have changed a single thing about what had just happened. And because there is a kind of dignity in not giving people the version of yourself they expect. He drove home through the October slush and sat in his truck in the driveway for 6 minutes before going inside. He sat there because Lily Annie was at school until 3:15 and the house was empty, and he needed 6 minutes to arrange his face into something that would not frighten her. The diagnostic report had come across his desk in August. That was where it started, though he hadn't known it then. Harwick had taken on a major contract servicing heavy equipment for a northern pipeline expansion. Long-term, worth a significant amount, the kind of contract that gets mentioned in shareholder reports. As part of the contract, Doyle had been tasked with overseeing the inspection and certification of a fleet of pressure monitoring units that would be installed along a 200-kilometer stretch of pipeline. The units were manufactured by a company called Caldwell Precision Systems. Doyle had worked with Caldwell equipment before and had no complaint with it. But when he ran the third unit through the bench tests, something was wrong. The pressure tolerances were off by a margin that wouldn't register in a standard check, but would accumulate over 18 months of continuous operation. He ran the test 4 times. He checked his calibration equipment. He called in his colleague Grant Fellows and had him run the same test without telling him what he was looking for. And Grant got the same result. He wrote it up. He documented everything. He sent the report to Terrence Ogilby's office on a Friday afternoon with a recommendation that the units be returned to Caldwell for re-inspection before installation. On Monday, Terrence Ogilby called him in and told him the report was noted, that the technical team at Caldwell had been informed, and that Harwick was satisfied with Caldwell's assurance that the units met specification. "They don't meet specification," Doyle said. "I have the test data. Caldwell's own engineers. Caldwell's engineers have a contract worth several $1,000,000 riding on those units passing inspection," Doyle said. "I'm telling you what the bench tests show." Terrence Ogilby had looked at him with an expression Doyle now recognized as the same one he'd worn in the conference room 6 weeks later, that careful, managed calm. "We appreciate your diligence, Doyle, but the decision has been made at the executive level." Doyle had gone back to his desk and added a note to the file and sent a copy to his personal email and thought, "This is going to go badly." 2 weeks after his termination, it started to. He heard about it from Grant, who called him on a Thursday evening while Lily Annie was doing her homework at the kitchen table and Doyle was making pasta. A pressure event at the Kilometer 63 installation. Nothing catastrophic, not yet. A monitoring failure that had triggered an automatic shutdown, which had done its job. No spill. But the reason for the monitoring failure was the accumulated tolerance error in the units, exactly as Doyle had documented. The pipeline operator was demanding answers. The Alberta energy regulator was being briefed. Doyle stood in his kitchen with the phone against his ear and the pasta boiling over and Lily Ann saying, "Dad, the pot," and thought, "I said so." And then, because he was not a man who spent much time on self-pity, "What do I do with this now?" He found work. It took 6 weeks, and it was contract work rather than permanent, but it was honest and it paid. He serviced equipment for a smaller outfit in Airdrie, drove 40 minutes each way, picked up Lily Ann from her after-school program at 5:15. The routine was thin, but it helped. Lily Ann adjusted the way children adjust, by folding the new reality into herself and continuing. She had her grandmother, Doyle's mother, Evelyn, who drove in from Okotoks on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She had her school, her best friend a girl named Paige who lived 3 houses down. She had a orange tabby cat named Russet, who had belonged to Claire, and now slept at the foot of Lily Anna's bed every night, with the loyalty of an animal who understood grief without having a name for it. She had her father, who was there every morning and every evening and tried very hard to make sure the trying didn't show. She asked about him sometimes, about whether he was sad. She asked in the way children ask serious questions, sideways, while doing something else, as if she didn't want him to know she'd been thinking about it. One evening in January, While they were watching a nature program about Arctic foxes, she said without looking away from the screen, "You don't laugh as much as you used to." "I laugh," Doyle said. "Not the same kind," she said. And then the Arctic fox did something startling and she forgot to follow up, and Doyle sat there with the observation sitting on him like a stone. He met Katherine Rourke in February. He hadn't been looking for anything. That sounds like something people say when they mean the opposite, but in Doyle's case, it was simply the truth. He was not a man prone to self-deception, and he knew that what he felt most of the time was a low-level exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. The thought of adding anything or anyone to the careful structure of his days was not appealing. He had enough to carry. She was a project coordinator at the Airdrie firm, not someone he'd seen in his first weeks there because she'd been on maternity leave. She came back to the office on a Tuesday in February, and Doyle met her for the first time in the break room, where she was reading a report and eating an apple, and looked up when he came in and said, "You're the new diagnostic guy," which struck him as an efficient way to introduce a conversation. "Doyle Mackinnon," he said. "Katherine Rourke," she said. "Most people call me Kit. The report you submitted on the Brenfield unit was good. You caught something our last guy missed for 2 years. Doyle poured his coffee. "It wasn't subtle." "It wasn't," she agreed. "But you'd be surprised what gets missed when people aren't paying attention." She went back to her report. Doyle drank his coffee. That was the whole conversation. But he thought about it on the drive home, which surprised him. She was in her late 30s, he guessed. There was a directness to her that reminded him of Claire in one way, and differed from Claire in every other. Where Claire had been warm and open, and inclined to trust people immediately, Katherine Rourke had the quality of someone who listened carefully before deciding anything. She didn't make small talk. She said what she thought. She had, he learned over the following weeks, a dry and unexpected sense of humor that surfaced without warning in the middle of entirely serious conversations, and which she delivered without any change in expression. He didn't think of it as attraction, at first. It was more like noticing. Like when you've been inside a building all day, and you step out and notice that the light has changed. They fell into a habit of talking after site meetings. She knew construction and energy infrastructure better than most people he'd worked with. She asked him questions about diagnostic methodology that were more technically precise than the questions he usually got from coordinators. She was good at her job, in the way that people are good at things they find genuinely interesting. He told her about Lily-Ann in March, in the context of explaining why he couldn't stay for the Friday afternoon debrief. He said he had to pick up his daughter by 5:15. She said, "How old?" And when he said 7, she said, "My nephew is 7. It's a good age." They're still honest. And he found himself saying, "She is." Almost uncomfortably so, and she'd smiled at that, a real smile, not a polite one. He didn't tell her about Claire for another month. When he did, it was because she'd asked directly. They'd been talking about something else, the pipeline incident, which had been in the news again because the investigation was broadening. And she'd asked how he knew the units were faulty, and he'd explained the sequence. And she'd asked why he'd been back at work only a few weeks after being let go. And he'd told her about the mortgage, the routine, the need for structure. And she'd said, quietly, not making a production of it, "Are you on your own with her?" "Since last October," he said. "Her mother passed." Katherine had not said she was sorry, which he appreciated. People said they were sorry so often that the words had worn smooth. She had just nodded and looked at him for a moment as though recalibrating something and said, "That's a lot to hold." "It is," he said, and left it there. By April he knew he was in trouble. Not the bad kind, or maybe both kinds at once. He found himself thinking about her in the gaps between other thoughts, which was not something he'd experienced in so long that it took him several weeks to identify what it was. He'd catch himself almost mentioning her to Evelyn and then pulling back. He told Lily-Ann very little. She was 7 and perceptive, and he wasn't ready for the questions she would ask. He didn't say anything to Katherine. He wasn't sure what he would say. And he wasn't sure whether what he felt was something she would welcome, and he was too old and too tired to be wrong about that. The thing that changed it was small. They were the last two left after a site review in early April, and it was raining the specific rain of Alberta spring that comes in sideways, and she was trying to pull up directions on her phone with a cracked screen that wasn't responding properly, and he'd said, without thinking, "I'll drive you." And she'd said, "You don't have to." And he'd said, "I know," and she'd put her phone in her pocket and said, "All right." They'd driven mostly in silence, the comfortable kind. He'd found her apartment building and stopped at the curb, and she'd said, "Thank you," and gathered her things, and then paused with her hand on the door and said, without looking at him, "Do you want to get dinner sometime? Not as a work thing." He'd been quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes." She'd nodded, got out, and walked to her door without looking back. And he'd sat there in the rain for a few seconds feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, which was the particular lightness of something you'd been hoping for arriving. They had dinner, and then another dinner, and then a Saturday afternoon at the farmer's market, which had not been planned and had become 3 hours without either of them noticing. She made him laugh in the way he hadn't laughed in longer than he'd admitted to himself. He introduced her to Liliana in May, carefully, without ceremony, as someone from work who was a friend. Liliana had assessed her with the complete candor of a 7-year-old and asked her if she knew what a narwhal was, which was apparently her current standard for evaluating adults. Katherine had said she did, and had offered an accurate description of narwhal migration patterns, and Liliana had said, "Dad, she knows about narwhals," in a tone that communicated approval. Doyle had caught Katherine's eye over Liliana's head, and something had passed between them that he didn't have a word for. He still hadn't told her everything. About what he'd filed, what he'd documented, what had happened to those pipeline units. He'd mentioned the incident, of course. It was in the news, but he hadn't told her about his role. Hadn't told her who he'd reported to, who had dismissed it, whose decision had led to his termination 8 weeks after that report landed. He hadn't told her because he'd learned her father's name in March, and what her father's name was. Crawford Rourke was the founder and majority shareholder of Rourke Capital Ventures, which had been the primary investment vehicle behind Caldwell Precision Systems' expansion into the pipeline monitoring sector. He was not a name Doyle had known before March, when a financial journalist piece in the Globe and Mail had traced the ownership structure of Caldwell upstream and found, among other things, Crawford Rourke's involvement. The same article mentioned, in a single sentence toward the end, that Harwick Industrial had dismissed concerns raised by at least one internal technician prior to the unit's installation. Doyle had read that sentence 3 times. He had not called Katherine that night. He had sat with Lily Ann while she read her library book, and he had looked at the wall and thought about what it meant to be building something careful and deliberate with a person whose father may have been the upstream cause of everything he'd lost. He thought, "I should tell her." He thought, "What does it change?" He thought, "It changes whether she can trust that I told her." He didn't call her that night. But he didn't stop returning her calls either. The investigation moved through the spring. By June, the Alberta Energy Regulator had formally confirmed that the pressure monitoring units had been operating below certified specification. Caldwell Precision Systems issued a statement citing manufacturing anomalies and announced a recall. The statement did not mention that an internal technician at Harwick had flagged the issue 9 months prior. A journalist named Audra Pelletier, who covered energy and infrastructure for the Calgary Herald, contacted Doyle by email. She had found him through a source she declined to name. She asked if he would speak with her on background about his experience at Harwick. She told him she had the filing. She had his diagnostic report, the one he'd sent to Terrence Ogilby's office in August. He called her back the same evening. He told her what he'd found and when he'd found it and what had happened after. He was careful with his words. He said that he couldn't speak to what decisions were made above Terence Ogilvy's level, only what he'd been told. She asked whether his termination had followed within weeks of the report being dismissed. He said it had. She asked whether he intended to file a formal complaint with the regulator. He said he'd been considering it. She asked whether there was anyone at Harwick he thought had acted in good faith. He thought about Walter Vance, who had hired him, who had aged visibly in the past year, who had sent him a handwritten note after Claire's funeral. He said, "I think there are people at that company who didn't know what they didn't know." He didn't say Katherine's name. He didn't mention her. He sat on the call for 40 minutes, and when it was done, he sat in his kitchen in the early summer dark and thought about what came next. He told Katherine the following weekend. They were at Edworthy Park, the three of them. Because it had started to be natural, the three of them, in a way Doyle hadn't anticipated and had stopped trying to guard against. Liliana was running ahead on the path, within sight, engaged in a private project involving a stick and a series of rocks. It was warm enough that they'd left their jackets in the car. He said, "I need to tell you something." She slowed slightly, the way she did when something shifted in his voice. He told her. All of it, the report, Terence Ogilvy's dismissal of it, the termination, the incident at kilometer 63, the journalist, the regulator. And then he told her what he'd found in March about Crawford Rourke's investment in Caldwell, and that he'd known for 3 months, and hadn't said anything. Katherine was quiet for a while. The path curved around a grove of poplars, new-leafed and rustling, and Liliane was shouting something about a very large stick she'd found. "Why are you telling me now?" Katherine said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an honest question. "Because I was going to let it stay quiet," he said, "and I'm not able to do that anymore." She walked for a moment. "Do you think my father knew?" "I don't know," he said. "I know what Caldwell knew, and I know what I put in my report. What happened between those two things and who knew what, that's what the investigation is sorting out." "But you think he should have known?" He considered that. "I think when you put capital behind a company that makes safety-critical equipment, you have some obligation to know what that company is doing." "Yes." She nodded slowly. They had reached a bench near the river and she sat down on it, and he sat beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The river was high from snowmelt. A pair of Canada geese were moving upstream with great self-importance. "I'm not angry at you," she said. "You might be, later, maybe," she said, "but right now I'm not." She looked out at the river. "My father is. He's not a bad man in the ways that count most. But he's a man who has been very good at not looking at the things he doesn't want to see. I've known that about him for a long time." Doyle was quiet. "I can't tell you what he knew or didn't know," she said, "but I can tell you that I believe you. And I think what you did, filing that report, talking to the journalist, I think you had to." He looked at her. "I wasn't sure you'd see it that way." "I know," she said. "I could tell." She paused. "That's what the 3 months was about." He didn't deny it. "Yes." She was quiet again. Then Liliane came crashing back up the path with her stick, which turned out to be enormous, nearly as tall as she was, and she planted it in the ground beside the bench, and announced that she had decided it was a flag. "A flag for what?" Doyle said. She thought about this seriously. "For here," she said. "So people know where here is." Katherine looked at the stick, then at Liliane, and said with complete gravity, "That's a good use of a flag." Liliane beamed at her, and then she ran back down the path toward the river, and Doyle and Katherine sat on the bench in the late June warmth, and after a while Katherine said, "What happens next?" "I file the formal complaint on Monday," he said. "The journalist piece runs Wednesday." She nodded. "Okay. Okay? I'm not going to tell you not to," she said, "and I'm not going to disappear because it's complicated." She turned to look at him, direct in the way she always was. "That's not who I am." The formal complaint went to the Alberta Energy Regulator on a Monday morning in late June. Doyle drove to Airdrie afterward and did 3 hours of diagnostics on a hydraulic system that needed attention, because the work was there and because he was not a man who stopped working while things were in motion. Audra Pelletier's piece ran Wednesday, as promised. It was careful and thorough, and contained no accusations, only documented facts and a clear timeline. It noted that a technician had raised the concern in August, that the concern had been dismissed, and that the technician had been terminated 2 months later. It did not speculate about causation. It did not need to. Harwick Industrial issued a statement. Caldwell Precision Systems issued a second statement, longer and more defensive than the first. Crawford Rourke Ventures did not issue a statement. Katherine called her father on Thursday. She told Doyle about it afterward, briefly, the way she told him most things, without embellishment. She said her father had been quiet on the phone. He had asked her how long she'd known the man who'd filed the report. She'd said a few months. He'd been quiet again for a while, and then he'd said, "I should have read the technical reviews more carefully." It was not an apology. It was a man standing at the edge of a thing he'd been avoiding, looking down. "What did you say?" Doyle asked. "I said, yes," Katherine told him. "You should have." In September, Crawford Rourke contacted Doyle directly. Not through a lawyer, not through intermediaries, a phone call, which Doyle almost didn't take, and then did because he was curious about what the man would say. Crawford Rourke was 71 years old and sounded like it. His voice was the voice of a man who had spent 50 years in rooms where he was the most important person present, and who was finding that quality less useful to him now. He said he had spoken with his legal team. He said that Rourke Capital had made a series of decisions in relation to Caldwell that had not adequately weighted the technical risk assessment. He said he understood that Doyle had lost his position at Harwick, following the submission of a report that had proven to be accurate. He said that he would like to discuss a settlement. Doyle was quiet for a moment. He was sitting in his truck outside the shop in Airdrie. Through the windshield, the afternoon sun was doing something good to the mountains. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I'll have my lawyer call yours, but I want you to know something first." Crawford Rourke waited. "What I filed because it was the right thing to file. Not because of your daughter, not because of the outcome, because the data said what it said and people needed to know." He paused. "I want that clear." "It's clear," Crawford Rourke said. There was a note in his voice that Doyle hadn't expected. Not contrition exactly, but something quieter than the voice of a man who had spent 50 years being the most important person in the room. Something that knew what it had cost. The call ended. Doyle sat in the truck for a minute. Then he started the engine and drove back toward Cochrane. October came. The anniversary of Claire's death fell on a Wednesday, and Doyle took the day off work and took Lily Anna out of school and drove out to a lake an hour west of the city that Claire had loved. They didn't talk much. Liliane brought a drawing she'd made. She said it was the lake, though it was recognizable mainly as a blue oval, and she set it in the water and they watched it float. On the way home, Liliane said, from the back seat, "Do you think Mom can see us?" "I don't know," Doyle said. "I hope so. I think she can," Liliane said, with the certainty of a child who has not yet learned to second-guess what she knows. Doyle watched the road. The aspens along the highway had gone their October gold, every one of them in full color, the way they do in Alberta for exactly 2 weeks before the cold takes it. "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." That evening, Katherine came over for dinner. She brought a pie she had made, which she presented with the caveat that she was not a reliable baker. It was good, though. Liliana ate 2 slices and said so with emphasis. After dinner, after Liliane had gone to bed, they sat on the back step in the cool of the evening with mugs of tea. The yard was dark and quiet. Russet had appeared from somewhere and arranged himself on Katherine's feet. "How are you doing?" Katherine said. "Better than last year," Doyle said. "Worse than I'll be next year." She nodded. That was the right thing to say, and she knew it, which was why she didn't add anything. They sat there in the quiet. Somewhere down the street, a kid was riding a bike in the last of the evening light, and you could hear the wheels on the pavement. Doyle thought about everything that had led to this particular evening, The August report, the conference room, the pasta boiling over, the drive to Airdrie, the rain, the farmer's market, the park with the flag made of a stick, the things that had gone wrong, and the things that had been built anyway, in the spaces between what was lost. He didn't say any of this out loud. Some things don't need to be said to be true. The cat purred, the evening held them, and the kid on the bike rounded the corner and disappeared, and the street went quiet, and the stars came out one at a time over the rooftop, each one arriving in its own time, none of them asking permission.